Did you get that, listeners? If you know that, everything is transformed.
But you realise I now have to ask you, what was your answer? Because I'm guessing if you asked the question, you must have had an answer when you started doing the podcast. Has no one ever asked you yours?
No one's ever turned the question on. Damn you, Bradley. We were talking earlier about slipping swear words in. I could have let one go there.
I thought I had you there. I've been lucky enough to do some stuff with Team GB athletes from the Olympics and Paralympics, and we do some stuff with Premiership footballers. But over the years, we kind of kept going back to this point of what we think separated the best from the others, or those who made the most progress, or just the ones who are better learners. I think where we're at, we kind of think we live in an age where a lack of information is not the biggest barrier. The information is out there and exists, and if anything, we're overly bombarded with information these days. Is how do we separate the signal from the noise? How do we get rid of the clutter? And then how do we just make it accessible? And that, I think, as opposed to seeking out new answers, is the big challenge in terms of driving education standards forward. The biggest difference, I guess, for me between sport and education is I don't often have to convince any of my athletes that it's good to win a gold medal at the Olympics. So if you measure success based on where are you now compared to where you were 2 weeks ago, that is a much more robust form of motivation than me comparing myself to you, because I'm always relying on you being there, providing that external motivating factor. And if you're not, then it kind of just rebounds to my initial state.
Hello and welcome to the Qualified Tutor Podcast, the podcast that brings you the latest in the world of tutoring, edtech and education, and hopefully inspires in you the big change that each and every one of us is capable of. Qualified Tutor is an industry-leading tutor training organisation and online tutoring community for thousands of tutors around the world. This podcast is the voice of this community, where we aim to hear from tutors, teachers, entrepreneurs, coaches, business experts, students, tutorpreneurs, and more from the world of tutoring about what inspires them every day, how they can help tutors like you, and what they've learnt about tutoring along the way. The question is, what will you learn today?
Hello and welcome to the 135th episode of the Qualified Tutor Podcast. My name is Ludo Miller, the host of this podcast. Welcome back to regular listeners. Welcome to any of you for whom this is your first time listening to the Qualified Tutor Podcast. And a very warm welcome to our guest today, Bradley Busch. Bradley, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Ludo. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, this was really a conversation and a discussion spawned by our wonderful episode 2 weeks ago with Arthur Moore, who the first thing Arthur said once the recording is finished is, you have to get Bradley Busch onto the podcast. So I reached out immediately, as any good podcast host would do. So I'm very glad that you're here with us today, Bradley. And we're going to be talking a little bit about, obviously, some of the latest pedagogical research in some areas that will be interesting to our audience. Obviously, there's a lot that you do with your business, Bradley, which we'll get onto in just a second. But a real good look here at some aspects of cognitive load theory, of metacognition, self-regulation, and of course, that all-important area of memory. But for those of you who haven't come across Bradley before, those of you listening, a brief introduction to Bradley so that you know where we're coming from today. Bradley is the founder of InnerDrive, a fantastic mindset coaching organization that runs teaching and learning CPD alongside their workshops aimed at students themselves. And Bradley is also the author of The Science of Learning, which is a massive piece of work, really, for Bradley and his co-author, Edward Watson, who I believe is actually in the room with us today, although not on the podcast, that summarizes many of the best studies in teaching and learning and distills them into easily digestible pointers and guidance. So the link to that will be in the show notes below. And Bradley, kind of the other side of Bradley's psychology work, one side being the education and one of the other sides being sports psychology. So Bradley is a former, actually current sports psychologist with a number of top football clubs and Olympic athletes on his roster. He is also a fiendish anagram creator, and perhaps a little bit more on that later. There was a brilliant TEDx talk, that Bradley did a few years ago that we might touch on as well. So just a bit there to be getting on with. But Bradley, amongst all of that, you're here today, Tuesday, the 11th of October. What's giving you reason to smile today, Bradley?
Good question. It was my wife's birthday a few days ago, and I managed to get through it without buying the wrong presents, managing to herd the kids into wrapping presents that resembled vaguely what a wrapped present should look like. And yes, survived the weekend. So that's probably, my big winner of recent days.
It only comes around once a year, doesn't it? That's the trick.
I tell you what, have a high love of birthdays and presents. Have a deep hatred for wrapping presents. It's, I don't think there's anything more stressful.
Well, we won't touch on the wrapping part anymore. Then, in fact, it's funny you just mentioned that, because the episode I said last week was with the wrapping science teacher. But this is with an R on the front, not a W. So, Bradley, we like to start our conversation from the perspective of the why behind why our guests do what they do today. So, I was wondering if you'd thought a little bit before about your why, and whether you could tell us, right now, what you think your why is.
Yeah, I guess. I taught for a few years in a college part-time, and I think I was okay at the time, but I was always I used to get quite frustrated. I felt I was, to be honest with you, just like blindly guessing on what I'm meant to do. And, I was picking some stuff up with trial and error, but I just got to a stage where I kind of realized that everything that I was struggling with, someone smarter than me had researched it somewhere. And we might not have definitive answers, but pretty much everything that I could think of, like, why were my students forgetting stuff that I taught them last week? How do we motivate bored students? Even how much homework should we set? Like, someone somewhere has researched it. And yet it was really frustrating that all this research is behind paywalls, or it's written in a really psych-heavy jargon, and it's just really inaccessible to the people who need it the most and can make the most difference with it, i.e. often teachers. And so that's really why my colleague and I, Edward, we made the decision to really try and make this stuff accessible. So we wrote our book, The Science of Learning, and it's been a big driving force in the CPD workshops that we do to schools and the student workshops, because we think there's gold in the research and it can change lives if it's just presented in the right way and if it's accessible to the people who can do the most with it. So yeah, I think there's a deep and profound sense of, can we make society better through education? Can we use research as a vehicle for that?
I presume the answer is yes to both of those questions.
Hopefully. I'm always wary of overclaiming, but Edward, he would definitely say yes, absolutely. The answer is yes, but I would probably go for I hope so.
If the answer to both those questions wasn't yes, you'd be floundering as to why.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and a bit like a tutor then there, in that you are taking research and studies and pedagogy and turning that into a format, or putting that into a format that is digestible by the greater public, or by your students. If you're a tutor, I think there's that simplification process is really important there, and is clear, a very clear part of InnerDrive.
And I mean, I think where we're at, we kind of think we live in an age where, like, a lack of information is not the biggest barrier. Like, the information is out there and exists, and if anything, we're overly bombarded with information these days. Is how do we separate the signal from the noise? How do we get rid of the clutter? And then how do we just make it accessible? And that, I think, as opposed to seeking out new answers, is the big challenge in terms of driving education standards forward.
Well, I firsthand can state that the way that you present your information on InnerDrive and obviously on your very active Twitter page is is almost a bit like a sort of social media algorithm. The way that you've done the blogs, the way they link to each other, they're incredibly readable, very, very easy to understand. I didn't find myself, obviously, doing the research for this episode. It was late into the night that I was still researching some of these points, because your stuff on, metacognition and on the use of questioning and that kind of thing is really central to the kind of discussions that we have in our community. So the InnerDrive stuff, I feel like, is almost going to be addictive for our listeners. So
I mean that is really kind of you to say. I just quickly say I would love to take the credit for all of it. If I had my way, I'd be writing psych thesis the whole time, and it really is kind of a team effort on the content and the format. And so we're lucky here, I guess, in InnerDrive, that there's a really nice and talented team who, it's a big team effort.
Mm. So you have a background, obviously, in sports science, and that converted itself through your early career into sports psychology, and now you've kind of added or included teaching and learning education to the psychology work and the consultancy work you do. Could you tell us a little bit about why that route and why you think those areas might be kind of linked?
Yeah, I mean, so growing up, you asked what my kind of why was. If you'd have asked me at like 18 or 20, I'd have probably said something like trying to help England win the World Cup, would have probably ranked pretty highly on it. And, I've been lucky enough to do some stuff with Team GB athletes from the Olympics and Paralympics, and we do some stuff with Premiership footballers. But over the years, we kind of kept going back to this point of what we think separated the best from the others, or those who made the most progress, or just the ones who are better learners. And so we became really interested in why do some people learn faster than others, regardless of the context almost? And that's where we kind of really went down the rabbit hole of the science of learning. And I guess a key part for us was all the research around that comes from educational psychology. And it's done on either studies of university students or secondary or primary students. And so the concept of learning, it's just so broad in terms of how do we then increase motivation to want to learn? So you can look at the research in that area. And then how do we improve memory and stuff like retrieval and cognitive load kind of comes into it. And then even stuff around, people who learn better are better at receiving feedback. And so what does the research kind of say around that? And all of these components to learning, I just think are so powerful. And that's where it was a natural step to really then in the last 10 years focus on education, because it's such a formative period of your life. And we kind of think if we can help students get that part right, everything is better then.
Did you ever tap into, when you were working with athletes and football players, did you tap into their education, their upbringing? Was their schooling a large part of, their work and their mindset, at adult age?
Yeah, I'd say it was certainly a key part of their mindset. What's fascinating, I guess, to me is there's such a large range. So I did work with a number of players who were from a single parent family who lived on an inner city estate. But on the flip side, I did work with a number of players with, a very different background and had gone through the education system as well. So we did see a large range. There were some common features, I think, on reflection. So the ones, as I said, the ones who made the most progress were the best learners. I think they were able to deal with setbacks better. I think they were better able to self-reflect on their performance regardless of the outcome, which I think has nice links to stuff like metacognition is how do you review and reflect on what you did well and what can be done better. And so, we did see quite a lot of parallels. The biggest difference, I guess, for me between sport and education is I don't often have to convince any of my athletes that it's good to win a gold medal at the Olympics. They've kind of consensually signed up to be part of that process. Whereas school and education is one of those weird things where I want you to have intrinsic motivation towards doing it and doing it well. I want you to want to learn, but we also know that essentially there's a big extrinsic motivator of it's the law and you don't have a choice by and large. So how do you develop intrinsic motivation for something that isn't an intrinsic initial choice? And that's, I think, one of the biggest differences between sport and education.
I'm not going to let you get away with it that easily, Bradley. How do you develop intrinsic motivation in children?
So one of the biggest changes, I think, now how I see this stuff is I used to think you focus on motivation, and therefore if I can motivate students to work hard, they're more likely to be successful. And that is true, I think, in part, but there's been some nice research that shows it works both ways. So if you can help people experience success, they're more likely to be motivated. Most people like to do stuff that they're good at. And so therefore, that's where pedagogy, I think, comes really into it, is how do I then either scaffold support or create the task design where they experience some success early on, and then either I increase the level of difficulty or I reduce the support. But actually, by not starting on motivation, by starting on success and developing competence, I think starts the positive cycle of success, motivation, success, motivation. So I think that for me is the starting point.
Okay, so one of those key ways might be showing children that if they are able to build on their own successes and visualize their own successes, then subtly and perhaps without them realizing, you'll start to create that cycle you've just created there.
So like one of the research theories are mainly around self-efficacy, which is kind of situation-specific confidence. How confident do I feel at math? How confident do I feel doing DIY at home? You have these different levels of confidence in each domain. And the biggest predictor of that is previous performance. And therefore, the reason why it's a mistake to focus too much initially just on motivation is if you give me this big pep talk to motivate you, and then I only go experience failure, that carries more weight than the fluffy pep talk, because there's more previous experience that's there. So yes, experiencing early success and structuring that, and then kind of what you're talking about, what we refer to as self-reference behavior. So if you measure success based on where are you now compared to where you were 2 weeks ago, that is a much more robust form of motivation than me comparing myself to you, because I'm always relying on you being there, providing that external motivating factor. And if you're not, then it kind of just rebounds to my initial state.
And that's such a it can be such a toxic part of schools, isn't it? Is children comparing themselves to each other rather than comparing themselves to their own progress.
Yes, but I think there's two things that are really interesting there in terms of, especially in teenagers, we know social status carries more weight for the teenage brain. So they're naturally going to want to do that anyway. That's kind of where they figure out, where do I sit in the hierarchy or the pecking order of things? I can figure out if I'm good at something by comparing myself to my immediate peers. So they're naturally going to do that. And then it gets made worse, I think, because as a society, we kind of have all these little subtle mechanisms that actually encourage people to compare themselves to others. So my favorite example is, if we go back to sport for a second, the award that everyone wants to win in football, for example, is player of the season. Like, that means you're the best player. You're better than everyone else who you play with, player of the season. The award that no one wants to win is most improved player, because the stigma around most improved is you were rubbish and now you can kind of run in a straight line without falling over. And yet, most improved should be the high coveted award, because everyone can run that race. Everyone can win that regardless of ability. And even on awards night, everything builds up. The final award is player of the season. And so as a society, we do kind of subtly value this comparing to ourselves, even though it's long-term probably quite detrimental for motivation.
Yeah, there's I guess that will necessitate a real cultural change across all areas, won't it? I mean, that's not something that's easy to fix, but in the specific situation of a of a tutoring environment, the tutor, the trusted adult, can very much start to influence that not being influenced by your peers. But actually, something else that you mentioned there that I really wanted to pick up on was the best tutors will build in those quick wins at the start of a series of sessions with a student, to give the impression that the student is learning quickly, but also to, not just for any kind of pretense or feigning, but, really to improve that child's scaffolding to progress. I think building in those quick wins, seeing that success is massive. Now, we've touched on it just a couple of times already, but the theme of, we have a theme every month in our Love Tutoring community. And this month, the theme is what works. So a look at metacognition and self-regulation based off Lee Elliott Major and Steve Higgins' 2019 book, What Works. Could you could you give us a few insights into how an educator can implement metacognition in that the learning of their students? What does that actually mean to make use of metacognition?
Yeah, I think it's an area that confuses a lot of people because it's not intuitive from the name what it is. And if you ask most people who have some knowledge of metacognition, they often say, oh, it's kind of like thinking about your thinking. But the problem with thinking about your thinking is that's quite a vague and abstract term. What does that look like in a session? So one of the best definitions we've seen from the Education Endowment Foundation, their definition of metacognition is the ability to direct, review, and monitor your learning. And I think if you talk about it in that terms, the ability to direct, review, and monitor your learning, you can attach strategies to each component part. So for example, I've seen it broken down as, can we talk about it before, during, and after learning? So the before part, how do we help motivate students to want to learn? How do we get them to reflect on what is this task similar to, and what have I done previously that has worked or hasn't worked well? In the during part of the learning, how do we help students stay on track, not get distracted, manage their emotions whilst doing so? And then the last part, what they refer to as reviewing your learning, is kind of the after. That's your relationship with feedback. So can I reflect on what worked well? One of my favorite questions I think everyone should be aware of to get students asking themselves is, what would I do differently next time? I think that is a great question because it puts a sense of control over the situation. What can I do differently? But also puts emphasis on behavior and process as opposed to just dwelling on the outcome. And so I understand why some people are put off by the phrase metacognition, because it's so broad, it feels like it covers everything, but then it's, on the flip side, it makes it quite hard to pin it down. But if you start to think about it as before, during, or after learning, or ability to monitor, direct, and review learning, I think you can then target quite nicely specific parts of that.
Yeah, and just as you say there, it often, and a few years ago, I probably wouldn't have been able to define or describe what metacognition meant, especially in the field of tutoring. Is there, if people want to learn more in their own time about metacognition, are there some good kind of literary? Where is the best place for people to go to keep up to date with these kind of things, and so they don't feel too confused by it on a continual basis?
Yeah. So with my self-promotional hat on, the InnerDrive website, innerdrive.co.uk, about once or twice a week, every time we find a teaching and learning study, often linked to metacognition, we summarise it and put it up and share resources for free. Outside of our own site, I do think the Education Endowment Foundation, their toolkit, again, it's a free resource that compares and contrasts different learning interventions. They have a really, really good and thorough overview, and it's very digestible and accessible. So I think those are the two that I usually tell people to start with. I think that's probably your best bet. Yeah.
We brought you onto the podcast because you do wonderful things, Bradley. There's no need to worry about self-promotion. Now, another key area, I want to avoid too much, giving a sense of overwhelm to our listeners today. We could run through everything that you've researched in your career, Bradley, but the first one I wanted to talk about was metacognition and how that fits in. But the second one is your work on memory. And I mean, fairly bluntly, I just want to ask, what do tutors need to know about memory?
Okay, let's say two things to keep it simple. The first is, and it doesn't sound very nice to say, but the people that you're tutoring probably have a very poor understanding of what helps their learning. So people often confuse what they like and what they prefer with what's best for them. So you'll have some students saying, I just learn better when I listen to music, and highlighting really helps me. And what they often mean is, and they might be right, there is a chance, but often what they mean is, these are the things I like doing because learning is hard and or boring, and therefore this makes it either easier or more fun. So people are really bad at predicting what's actually good for them. And the second thing I think that everyone needs to know, which builds on the first, is as a rough rule of thumb, the harder you think about stuff, the more likely you are to remember it. And that's why, for example, highlighting or just rereading your notes doesn't really help, because I can skim read, I can highlight on autopilot and I can brainlessly and aimlessly highlight. Whereas the stuff that makes you think harder about stuff, revisiting stuff that you almost forgot that you did 3 weeks ago, generating an answer to a question, otherwise known as retrieval practice, comparing and contrasting similar but different things in the research that's known as interleaving. These are the sort of things that you can't do without thinking hard about, and in doing so makes you far more likely to remember it. So I used to think for years, you did a lot of learning and then you do a quiz at the end and the quiz assessed how much you've learned. Whereas I now think the quiz doesn't just assess the learning, the quiz accelerates the learning. The quiz is the learning. And so by getting them to generate answers, and you can do that in loads of different formats, past papers, multiple choice quizzes, even verbal Q&A, but anything that makes the students think hard, makes them generate an answer to a question, makes them recall it from their memory, I think they're more likely to remember it next time.
And there's something really important there about building in silence to your sessions, isn't there? I'm pretty sure it was you guys that I watched an awesome video about not second guessing a student's lack of an answer as lack of knowledge, and being able to allow the student time to reflect on a question.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably one of the biggest changes to my own personal practice. So I used to think learning should have been this fast back and forth between me and the learner, literally like neurons are firing between us, because that's what I thought learning looked like. And actually, if you now consider, if I'm saying this retrieval, recalling information from memory helps accelerate learning, then if I ask a question and you start trying to retrieve it, but then I cut that time too quick and I just give you the answer, or I press you to giving like a quick answer, then not only is your answer likely to be of lower quality, but I've short-circuited that retrieval process, which means you're less likely to remember it next time. And so now I think learning sometimes does look uncomfortable and awkward and silent, but I'm after their best answer, not necessarily their first answer. And I mean, if you look at the research, the amount of time people wait after they ask a question before they get an answer, I think it's usually about a second. Like it's tiny. And you can't really ever come up with anything good in that time. So I think having the self-discipline to give it a bit more time is important. Now, then the obvious question becomes, why do people not give it enough time? And I think there's a couple of reasons. One is I think, there's an area like called action bias. So like we feel better when we're doing something. Like I'm paid to be tutoring you, so therefore I should be doing stuff as opposed to just sitting here waiting. So we kind of feel better when we do stuff. As a side note, and I know this because you're a football fan, this is why apparently if goalkeepers stayed still on a penalty and stayed in the middle, they'd save twice the amount of goals. But the reason they don't and they die is because you feel like you're meant to do something, like you're meant to be trying to save it, essentially. So there's this action bias that happens, I think. I think another reason is people have good intentions. Like we all get into education because we generally want to help and support students. And so therefore, if I see you struggling, because I'm nice and with good intentions, I want to then help you and stop you from struggling. Well, actually that struggle, if done in a supportive environment, is an essential part, I think, of that learning process.
Yeah, it is the learning itself, isn't it? The learner themselves taking themselves from the place of no knowledge to the place of knowledge. Yeah, that kind of trust bridge. Now, Bradley, oftentimes on this podcast, we open up the question. I say oftentimes, actually, we used it a lot. It was a question we used a lot in the early days of the podcast, and then we felt it was a bit too cliche. But I've since brought it back in a couple of episodes, and that question is, because I see that you're a bit of a visionary, Bradley, a bit of a dreamer on some of these things. If you had a magic wand that you could wave over the education landscape, what would we see?
If I had a magic wand over the education landscape, I would say I would get rid of paywalls behind research, would be the first thing. And I would probably try and come up with a system where the researchers themselves spoke directly to their audience as opposed to other researchers. So making it as accessible as possible. I don't think any research can ever give a definitive answer, but I think they can give guidelines and we can then adapt within those guidelines. And so I think that for me is key, because I see parents, and I'm speaking as one who's their kids just started school, so desperate for their kid to do well, but not knowing what actually helps and what we're meant to be doing. I see teachers who are under immense pressure from workload. Once you know about research, it eases the time pressure to an extent, because you don't waste time on stuff that's not as effective. And I see students having absolutely no idea how to learn and revise. And even the ones who are really, really smart to the ones who are really struggling, often, and it is getting better, but they still don't know really how learning happens. And I think if you know that, everything is transformed.
Did you get that, listeners? If you know that, everything is transformed.
But you realise I now have to ask you, what was your answer? Because I'm guessing if you asked the question, you must have had an answer when you started doing the podcast. Has no one ever asked you yours?
No one's ever turned the question on. Damn you, Bradley. We were talking earlier about slipping swear words in. I could have let one go there.
I thought I had you there.
I would see classrooms themselves reshaped and rethought.
Oh God, in what way?
Well, I'm certainly not the first to think this. I've taken this good idea from something I've read before, so you can't credit me for this, but the idea that people sit, or that students sit in rows facing a single teacher with perhaps a smartboard at the front, but maybe not even, I think is a little antiquated. And I think the idea that we could encompass, or at least integrate, tutor, quote unquote, style individuals who could come in and break down the content learning. I don't believe that curricula should be abolished, but just that the way that a classroom is set up could be adapted, and we could use technology more effectively to deliver that first up learning, and then the discussion based stuff is done in smaller groups with a tutor style individual. That's something I see as a better use of everyone's time in the classroom: the teacher, the schools, the trustee boards, all those kind of things, and of course the students themselves.
See, this is why you're going to have to get me back for your 270th podcast episode, because I'm a massive fan of rows. I've always been a bit of a sucker for teacher at the front. So yeah, I'm open to being convinced, but probably don't have time in this podcast, I guess.
No. Yeah, there's a whole conversation in there, and it's important. I'm very glad, Bradley, that that's not the first question of the podcast, because as good as those dreams and those visions are, I think it's really important that podcast, and I hope this podcast gives listeners real kind of useful, implementable pointers, that they can go and use in a session, this evening, for example. And I think you've done that magnificently. So thank you very much, Bradley. And now, a brief word from last week's guest, Matt Green, whose episode you can catch after this.
It was a pleasure being invited on to the Qualified Tutor podcast. It was a pleasure meeting Ludo and having a good chat. And I think what Qualified Tutor does for tutors in terms of sharing information and helping to improve the quality of education for students is a fantastic thing. And yeah, it's something that I'd be happy to do anytime again in the future.
We have one final question, which is, what's next for you, Bradley? What's next for Bradley Busch?
Good question. We, Edward and I, my co-author of The Science of Learning, we have our next book coming out in Easter called Teaching and Learning Illuminated, where we're going to try and use some of the visual representations of these key points to try and make them as understandable as possible. And we are currently expanding our Cognitive Science Network, which is a collection of schools who want to be at the forefront of research and teaching and learning, that they can share best practice with one another. So that's, I guess, our two immediate focuses at the moment.
I assume there could also have been a new science of learning with an astronomically high number of studies.
Edward made me promise to cap him at 99 because if I had my way, we'd do another one every year. But
I felt like 111 was the next number. I don't know why.
I'll float that by him. The problem is they're a right labour of love and take up all your time. But yeah, no, it was a good process writing the 99 studies one, because I think it's one of the best ways to actually get to know the research is by forcing yourself to summarise it and condense it and apply it. So yeah, I did love them, but I think that's where we draw the line on those.
So for any of you listeners who are not quite sure exactly what we're talking about, this is Bradley and Edward Watson's book, The Science of Learning. They started with 77 studies that they digested into these really easily understandable summaries for you to implement in your own learning. And they then took that to 99, and you can go and grab that book on their website. The show notes, the link for which will be in the show notes. Bradley, thank you so much for joining us. Truly, I do mean that. It's amazing to have someone who is genuinely an expert in lots of the fields that are most central to our audience. Thank you.
I'll take the praise. Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, if listeners want to get in touch with you straight after this, what is the one best way that they can do that?
If you go to InnerDrive.co.uk, our email address and contact details are on there. So that's probably the quickest and easiest way.
Awesome. Bradley, thank you very much for coming on. Next week, we will be speaking to Katie Tyndale about rewards programs to be used in schools, but how that may also be applicable to private educators and tutors as well. So a really good little chat there about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, which builds on this week. And this week's episode itself was built on Arthur Moore's episode from 2 weeks ago. So you can go and have a listen to that as well. But for one final time, thank you very much, Bradley, and we'll see you again next time.
Cheers. Thank you so much again.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Qualified Tutor Podcast. Whether you're a regular listener of this podcast or you've just stumbled across it, join the Qualified Tutor Podcast group within the Qualified Tutor community to stay up to date with our latest news, offers, workshops, and of course, simply to meet other tutors like you. Whatever your level as a tutor, our training courses will be the next step in your professional development. Visit qualifiedtutor.org/training to find out more about our CPD accredited and Ofqual recognised courses, the first of their kind in the tutoring industry. Your student deserves the best tutor possible. Make that happen today by joining Qualified Tutor